My name is Dmitry, and I'm an application architect at Calendly, where I get to work on all kinds of fun things. Actually, lately I've been focusing more on API integrations and breaking up our large monolithic application, but I enjoy solving front-end problems as well. Building great user experiences is a passion of mine, and front-end is obviously a big part of that. That's why I'm here. So today I'd like to talk to you about how we brought back some sanity into our form management code in our React application. You already know this, but React does not ship with a lot of things out of the box like some other frameworks do, and form management is one of them. So let's work through a simple example. Suppose we want to build a simple login form, just 2 fields and a button. Every application has something like that. So how would we might code this in React? The code would look something like this. Very simple so far, but just to make our example a little bit more realistic, we're going to go ahead and present custom components here, because every application customizes how the inputs and buttons and other things look like. So let's see how one of those text fields might be coded up. And this is something that we do at Calendly. I love styled components. We use a different library that is very similar to styled components. So nothing special here, a lot of styles, and then a primitive, one of the classic ways to mark up a form field with a label. I actually just attended Homer's session on accessibility and learned that some assistive tools do not read implicit labels. It's actually better to have an explicit label with a for attribute, but please humor this example just for the sake of brevity. And we're going to make sure to render an error because we'll be doing validation later on. And yeah, the only thing I want to call out is that when you're building these kinds of custom inputs, do make sure to pass all the native props to your native DOM input, so that if we want to pass name, max length, type, all these other things, so that they just work out of the box. Now, this form doesn't really do anything. We're just rendering a pretty form, but we're not handling it. If we wanted to actually take that information that the user entered and submit it to the server, we need to hook it up to the state and then read that state. And if we go to React documentation, this is roughly how they tell you to do it. We're using this controlled component pattern. How many of you have done something like that? Yep, and that's what we started with as well, but it quickly got out of hand. So you can already see that the code is quite a bit longer. We are introducing local state variables. We are hooking up our inputs to our change handlers, and then we can access the variables in our submit handler. So this code is just two fields, but it already barely fits on the slide. We're going to use whether it fits on the slide as kind of a benchmark of our boilerplate amount and repetition. Of course, you can get a little more clever here and collapse those change handlers into one universal handler that will set a key in our state object, look up the right field by the name. But then we will still be a bit verbose when it comes to validation. Speaking of which, let's try to add the simplest validation possible to this form. So all we care about is we want to make sure the user enters something. Email cannot be blank, password cannot be blank. The code no longer fits on the screen. I'm trying to show the most important parts here. So what changed is we now have this getErrors function that we call when the form submits, so that we don't proceed with submitting if there are validation errors. Oops. We check if email is empty, we check if password is empty, and then well, we're now connecting our errors object to those error props that we created earlier in our text fields. So yeah, there's already too much boilerplate. We're doing this explicit state management. We're doing explicit event handling. And here I only did on-change handlers. In reality, if you wanted to validate things as the user types them in, you would probably want to have on-focus and on-blur handlers. So I'm not showing that here. We're repeating the same field names a lot. Say for email, we start with a state variable that I'm not showing here because the code doesn't fit. Then we say if email, if not email, new errors.email, errors.email here, value equals email. That repetition just means you're likely to make a typo or copy paste the wrong thing, because you will be copy pasting this across your application. Other developers adding new forms will be copy pasting all that junk. And yeah, we're not getting into fancier validation. We're not tracking what fields the user visited, what fields the user has not visited. We're not doing asynchronous submission. So this is where Formik comes in. It's really there to clean this up and make your form management code more maintainable and help you write less boilerplate. Normally, it's easier to show how to use Formik, assuming that we already have a form, because you probably do. And a first pass at using Formik on an existing form would probably look something like that. And this is what the first version of Formik did, but then we'll look how we can improve this. So what changed here is we now have this Formik component that wraps our form. We're passing initial values to it, which is often handy if we want to initialize our form with something else that's else than empty values. We're passing our submit function to that new Formik component that comes from the Formik library. And then the immediate child of this form, of this Formik element, is a function. This is the render prop pattern. The argument that we get from this function is a context that Formik creates that manages the state for the whole form and its fields. And then what changed here is, instead of manually wiring up the change and focus and blur handlers and value binding for each field, we just let Formik generate all those props by calling formik.getFieldProps and then the name of the field. And it'll know to store everything related to that field in its state and handle all those event handlers. So this is already better. We're writing less code, but still a bit verbose. We're wrapping our form into this, into these two things, and then we have to call Formik getFieldProps every time. Not too big of a deal, but we can do better. And one way we can do better is we can essentially create a version of our text field and any other fields that we have that is wrapped in the Formik connector. So assuming we have an existing text field, and in my example, I'm putting it in components, form, text field. We're inputting that, I'm renaming it as raw text field. And then Formik gives us a series of useful hooks that we can use to connect our fields to Formik context. So use field, the first thing that it returns is all those props that connect the fields to the value from Formik and all the event handlers. And we're just putting these props on our original field component. And then we're putting any custom props on top of that so that our field is still customizable. And then meta contains a few things. Two of note is tracking whether the field has been already touched by the user, because we don't want to validate things that the user has not typed in yet. And then Formik also keeps track of validation errors, and if there's an error, it'll be in meta.error. So with that, the way Formik works, that a parent Formik component creates a React context that is available to any children. You don't have to have everything in one file. And then it looks up the field by its name prop. So you have to make sure to put name attributes on your field, which is good practice anyway. So with these new fields, our code is already much cleaner, less boilerplate. We don't have the render prop here, and we're just using our text field pretty much the same way we were using them in the original example. No explicit wiring up of state or event handlers. Now let's talk about validation. There are two ways you can go about this with Formik. You can write your own validation code from scratch. Formik allows you to do that. You can define your own corresponding handlers. Or a recommended approach is to use the validation library called Yup. Formik integrates very well with it. And using it very simple, you create this yup object where each key is the field that you want to validate, and the value is this chain call pattern where you define the type of the field, whether it's required, any other additional validation options. A few come out of the box, such as email validation, but of course you can write your own. And then all you do is you pass that schema object to the Formik component. And that's it. From now on, Formik will validate the form. We already connected our fields to Formik, which keeps track of everything, including validation. And it'll validate the form on submission. It'll also validate the fields as the user types information in them. So this is much better than doing this all by hand and repeating yourself every time. Here's for a better illustration than before and after. I don't expect you to be able to read before, and it also doesn't, it doesn't even fully fit on the slide. However, the Formik version, the entire form components does fit on the slide. The only thing I'm omitting are the imports at the top of the file, but this is it. We're importing Formik, we're wrapping our form in the Formik component. We could even create another component that merges together Formik and form, so we can type a little bit less. And that's all you have to do to handle validation, and then you can write whatever logic you need to write in the submission function. So what we've accomplished so far, and this was intended to be very quick because it is simple to use, simple to drop into your project. We've greatly reduced our boilerplate. We're no longer doing explicit state or event management. We have a fairly elegant, compact validation framework that we can extend. And it may be obvious, but it's important to know that we maintain full customizability of our elements. Formik is not a UI library. It doesn't tell you how to write, how to style your components. It just gives you all these hooks to connect your existing components to a context that manages this form state and handles all the annoying edge cases. And our components remain reusable. This form component, this field component, it's not specific to one form. It'll grab whatever form context this field is dropped into. So it is reusable. We do have to create new wrappers of all our form components that are Formik aware once, and then it's a drop-in replacement for our maybe existing old-fashioned forms and components. Check out Formik docs at formik.org. It has a helpful tutorial as well as a few advanced cases. And there are a couple more things I want to show, but any questions so far? Yes? So the question is there a way to have custom validation, and is there a way to tie it? Yes, and by the way, the second part is easy. In our, let's go back to our field components over here. Formik does not tell you how to style our component. Our original text field component, we made it to take an error prop, and then it's up to us how we style that error and where we show it. So Formik makes no assumptions about it. It just gives us access to the error message, and it's up to us how we render it. And yes, you absolutely can write your own validations. In my example, I only show the what comes out of the box here, yup, that string, that email, but you can add your own custom validation function here to do whatever you want, and you can even check other fields. You can have a more complex logic where you look at not just the current field, but other fields on the form. You can do that as well. You have, and I'll show this later, you, at any point in time, and that's what's great about a framework like Formik, you have access to the whole state of the form, whether it's been edited or not, and every error or every value of every field on the form. You can do that, so you can support more complex use cases. Any other questions so far? Yes? Yes, I don't have a slide for that, but instead of yup, you can basically write your own validator or something like that, or you can use a different library, you can write your own. Yes. So a couple more things I wanted to show and talk about. One is testing, because testing is important. I think as a community, we've arrived to the realization that we should test front-ends on multiple layers, and there are great tools for that. And spoiler, there shouldn't be anything different about how you test your UI, your forms, when you adopt Formik. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just walk through an example of using testing library, React testing library in this case. I'm a big fan of it. We use it at Calendly. And I love this passage from testing library documentation. And this really helps us write tests that we don't have to adjust every time we refactor our components or change the styles of them. Our focus should be in how we test to closely resemble how your web pages are interacted with by users. What this means in more practical terms is, in how we write tests, we should be interacting with the DOM. We should not be interacting with component instances. We should not be checking the internal state of the components. We should not be definitely calling or checking the lifecycle methods or any other methods you may have defined on your components. Some older test frameworks kind of make you do that, but that's not really the best practice. So here's what a happy path would look like. So I'm using testing library, as I said, and because in my silly demo, I'm just using window.alert to show that to simulate submitting the form, I am mocking window alert in my test so that I can check that that function was called. After that, we are rendering the whole app, so this is more of an end-to-end test. In reality, I would write component tests for each component in addition to that, but this is more of an end-to-end test, testing the whole flow. So then we find a field by label text. This is one of the recommended ways to find a form field, because each form field has to have a label. We shouldn't be looking it up by class or by ID or by anything else like that. By label text, that label text should be visible by the user, and it is in our example. So then there's this user event.type helper that just simulates typing in a more realistic way. We type in the email, password. We programmatically click the login button. Again, we find the button by text, and we make sure that it's a button, not a div or anything else like that. And then we just assert that our alert was called. And I added, to my alert, I wasn't showing in earlier slides, I added printing out the email and password just so we can verify in the test that we are indeed capturing what the user has entered. So this is it. This is the happy case, and I actually wrote a working demo app. I started with a simple vanilla approach without Formik. I wrote a test for it, and then I added Formik, and my test remained the same. The only little technicality that I had to change is, for some reason, I had to wrap fire event.click in an act, which is one of the ways React sometimes tells you to handle asynchronous interactions. So not sure why I had to do it, but I would count it as a technicality rather than a major test refactor. I do have full demo that you can run locally. It doesn't have a server, just throws an alert, but there is a working form coded in plain React and in Formik. I'll show you that in a second. So here's how the demo looks like, very simple. This is vanilla form, this is Formik form. They obviously look the same. Formik has a couple of other things, like it validates the fields as they change, because Formik just takes care of that out of the box. And let's do something, helloexample.com. And when we log in, it also changed the button to submitting, and I'm going to show you how we do this. And here's our alert. Dealing with the asynchronous submission is really simple. So instead of alert, we probably want to make a network request. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just calling a fetch right there in the submit function, and all we have to do is change our submit function to be async. Formik doesn't really care too much whether what's happening when you click submit, but what is helpful and what Formik does keep track of, it knows that if our submission handler returns a promise, it'll set an internal state variable is submitting while the promise is spinning, and then when the promise resolves, it'll reset that flag. And one way we can use that is if you're using Redux to kick off your action, then you just change that to dispatch. And one way you can use that is we can disable our submit button so that we prevent double submission, or we can give the user some visual feedback. We can rename the button or put a spinner on it instead of the text. That's one of the patterns we use at Calendly. So that is submitting is available from another hook called use Formik context. And that works out of the box as long as our submission handler returns a promise. There's also a way to manually set Formik form to submitting state if you have a more complicated use case. Another thing that I'll briefly cover is advanced fields. So obviously I showed a very primitive example of just having a text input. This is an almost one-to-one copy of another component that we have in Calendly. There's a place where we have a color picker, and we actually use a third-party library that implements a color picker. You click on it and gives you a nice color wheel, and you can enter the code, and then that picker closes, and it gives you a non-change handler. That component coming from a third-party library did not have a way to bind value to it directly, so we can't make it a control component easily. But what we can do is we can catch its own change, and then we can explicitly call Formik's set field value and set field touched. So this is the general pattern you will probably be following to code up more complex components. And there are all kinds of useful things that use Formik context returns. Here are some of them. So as I said, you have access to the full state, all values of all the fields, all errors of all the fields. With that, you can imagine how you can make a compound components that consists of more than one control or more than one field. Or you can have a more complicated case where changing data in one field changes or disables another field. You can do that too. The general format of all these functions is it takes the name of the input and then the value or the state that you want to set it to. So it's fairly extensible, and it goes beyond just the primitive cases. So this is all I had. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, very interesting talk. I'm curious, have you had any experience with other React form libraries like React Hook Form, and can you compare and contrast pros and cons of Formik versus some of these other guys?
Yes, I don't have the question was what's my opinion, or do I have experience about other similar form handling libraries for React? I don't have personal hands-on experience, but I did check out other solutions, and I can quickly talk through them. First, when Formik arrived, the common solution was Redux form, and that the author himself kind of admitted that it's not a good idea to keep form state in Redux. We also tried that at Calendly and went away from that approach. Other modern alternatives to Formik are React form hook, or React hook form, and then the other one is it's actually not React, it's Final Form. It's made by the author of Redux form. Just looking at the APIs of the three libraries, it's actually very similar. And what these libraries do under the hood is also pretty much the same. They create a context and give you all these hooks to easily manage form. You could totally make that yourself in the weekend. These libraries just do it for you, and in a more complete fashion, and handle all the annoying error cases. So I cannot particularly recommend one option over another. I know Formik is today the most popular. React documentation actually links to Formik, but I think your experience will be similar if you use any of the alternatives. Any other questions? Yeah. Which one? Okay. Yeah, so in this case, I'm wrapping an existing color picker component, and when it gives me a non-change callback, I am calling these functions coming from Formik, so that this Formik updates its state internally to keep up to date with the component.
Is there a parent Formik component wrapped around this? Because I noticed you haven't actually imported Formik itself.
Right. Let me clarify. So if you happen to not have a parent Formik component in your hierarchy, this code will fail, just like attempting to access a React context that is not provided somewhere higher up will not work. Because that's what Formik is doing under the hood. It creates a React context. But the nice thing is, and it follows the pattern of React context, you're not creating these components that are tightly coupled to a specific form. You can reuse them across your application, and they will access whatever nearest form context there is. Yes?
It's probably worth asking, how's the performance with Formik?
The question was about performance with Formik. We have not experienced performance issues with Formik. We have a number of more complex components like a time zone picker, a date picker, an interval picker. We don't have cases where we have dozens of fields on the form. So it's worked fine for us. Yes, in the back.
How popular is that Formik
So of all the modern, the question is how popular is Formik? Of all the modern approaches, libraries for handling forms in React, Formik is actually the most popular, and that's why React documentation today links to it. Yes?
So it looks like a common pattern is to wrap a lot of default components using Formik. Are there any libraries that have kind of done that with most of the default components, like text input, color pickers, things like that?
Is there a library that gives you UI components that already connects to Formik? I'm not aware of one, although some of the frameworks that we talked about at the conference, such as Blitz, has hooks to Formik. I don't believe it comes with a UI library though, because most applications have a custom UI, even if it's built on top of a library, and it's really not that difficult to connect your existing UI components to Formik. But yeah, I'm not aware of a completely out-of-the-box solution. There very well may be. We just didn't need one because we already had these components. Anybody else? Right, well, thank you very much. Feel free to follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I will tweet a link to these slides.